So the next kind of feeding from classroom management into the topic of lesson planning, we put them back to back because we really felt like they are so intertwined and so connected. And I don't know how you guys feel about lesson planning, but I think that there's a wide spectrum about what a lesson plan should look like, opinions, what should be in there, what shouldn't be in there, when do you do them, who sees them, how do they get turned in, all of those details. I think, though, that, and I teach a course at UNC Charlotte that's called Planning for K-12 Instruction. I haven't taught it in a few semesters, but it talks about the importance of just having some kind of a plan. And most of the time in our lives, when we are successful at things, it's because we at least have an idea of what we want to happen as the end result. Having that idea in mind. So when you leave your house, either in your car or in my case on the motorcycle, sometimes you just ride with no destination in mind. And sometimes, really most of the time, you're on a journey of some sort with a destination in your mind. Do you remember life before GPS? I have to say I'm kind of an odd person, I think, in that I prefer a paper map. I don't know if it's a trust issue because especially like when there are routes that I kind of know and the GPS is telling me she's telling me to do something and I'm like, that is not right. I know I'm supposed to go on this route. And anyway, I think the point of bringing up the GPS or the paper map, having a destination in mind, is that there are sometimes multiple pathways. And sometimes it is a leap of faith where, okay, this student may get to the same destination by taking a different route. But we have to have some kind of a plan that at least has a beginning, some kind of checkpoint, rest area, and some kind of destination. Rather than just get in your car and go and see where you end up. All roads lead to somewhere, right? Different feel. So when you guys think about lesson planning, just talk to me for a minute about what comes to your mind. Okay, so when we talk about lesson planning, obviously we all have expectations. Sometimes the expectations are completely relevant and connected to standards, and sometimes the expectations go a little beyond that. What do I want to happen in this activity? What do I want? What are my outcomes? Most of the time, we think about curriculum, and again, like what we mentioned this morning, that the curriculum is written from an Anglo perspective. So most of the time, a lot of strategies that we learn about are also from an Anglo perspective. And the expectations, oftentimes, of outcomes are from an Anglo perspective. When we start to open the door a little wider and have a broader view of possible outcomes, things begin to change. So I love the example we talked earlier about today with Native American culture, or maybe it's Midwestern culture. So how can we begin to shape our lesson plans to think about, well, here's this amazing project. Here's this set of amazing strategies. How can I put some kind of twist on it? Or allow for multiple twists so that there are different pathways ending up at the same result? It's very fascinating from a linguistic perspective and from a cultural perspective. It's also really hard because I don't know how you guys feel, but in some cases, I think when we as teachers come up with these activities and these strategies, we have in our minds what we want the kids to do. What do I want the the bulletin board, which may be as big as a billboard, what do I want this to look like? If it's a biology class, what do I want the poster of a cell to look like? In early developmental classes, do I want all the kids to somehow be doing something that looks similar? Because if I've given them a framework, they should all be doing the same thing, right? No, not always. And in most cases, if you allow the creativity to really flourish, things won't look at all the same. And can you live with that? Because that's a hard thing to kind of step back and let go of. The other thing that we ask you to think about when it comes to lesson preparation is understanding what students need themselves in order to prepare for performance. And when I say performance, I don't necessarily mean from like a musical perspective in Catherine's class. That's one way of performing. But there are multiple other ways that students have to perform in class. Maybe it's a class discussion. Maybe it's a small group activity where they have to interact with their peers. Maybe it's playing together on the playground. What steps do they need clarification about in order to get from A to Z? And how often do we miss the mark? Well, I told you what we're doing. How come why aren't you doing it? So thinking about how students prepare themselves. So an example that I like to give is, especially in middle school, I'm not going to pick on you all day. Middle school is an interesting place. Whew. When students are getting ready to do an activity, they need some time to like get their stuff together. They got to pull out their pencils, their Post-it notes, their notebooks, their process. Students don't always process things at the same rate. And so being able to prepare for that. And teachers' misunderstandings of, well, you're not listening. If you're not doing it like this, if you're not moving with a purpose all the time, you're not on the mark. So allowing for that. Classroom structure, making sure that the interactions within the lesson are structured. Oh my gosh, that's the favorite word of today is structure, organization. And making sure that tasks are in order and manageable. Kids need the structure more than you can imagine. More than you can imagine. It's like almost, it's odd because I don't want to compare it to like behavioral conditioning, but they have to practice. And the more they practice, even if it's not classroom management related, the more they practice some kind of a task or routine, the better it becomes. It's just that simple. So let's talk about chronic cultures. We have chronic, polychronic, and monochronic. And at first when I looked at this word, I was like, that's got to be a typo. But it's really not. There are cultures where people do multiple things at the same time and they communicate simultaneously and it is not considered disrespectful or distracting. Has anyone ever eaten dinner with a Lebanese family? Okay, so that's an easy no. The first time I had a meal with a large Lebanese Catholic family, I left like after 2 hours and I was completely exhausted just from listening. And it wasn't that they were speaking a language other than English. They were all communicating in English, but they were all communicating at the same time. There was no sense of when you're talking, I should listen and not say anything. And multitasking with like moving dishes around and passing plates and talking, and there was like so much communication happening simultaneously. You cannot believe it. Because I wasn't raised in an environment like that, so I didn't understand. I'm over here on this side. I was raised when you're working, you should be quiet. Or when somebody else is talking, I shouldn't say anything. But in a polychronic cultural setting, people's brains are in tune with all these things. I can talk to you and listen to what Cheryl's saying and understand that Debbie's going to do something and pass me the mashed potatoes, and all this is happening at the same time. And there are no hiccups. So when you ask a kid whose cultural reference of or cultural norm of communication is like that, and then they go in a classroom and they have to do some kind of cooperative learning activity, how are they going to handle that? They're going to multitask and they're going to talk about it because that's normal. This is how we act at home. And then you pair them up with a kid like me who gets distracted, who was told you cannot possibly be studying if your radio is on. And yes, I had a radio, transistor radio. That's how old I am, with batteries. So how do we deal with that? How do we plan for that? You tell me. Excellent. Putting me as a monochronic kid in a polychronic setting is uncomfortable for me. However, it was a skill set that I'm really happy I was exposed to. And then when I started thinking about it, and it wasn't just that one isolated incident, and thinking about multitasking and functioning, like, what if I was like my whole life growing up thinking, I really want to go to work on Wall Street? Has anybody watched a video clip of what happens on Wall Street inside the room where the stocks are being sold? What happens? Polychronic. And they're multitasking and they're communicating. So that is a skill set that is, or at an auction at some level. What are some other settings? Your classroom. The same thing goes for putting the polychronic kids in a situation where they have to learn the skill set of monochronic people. Because there will be times, maybe you have to go to a funeral where there's no dancing this time. And you need to sit there and be quiet. So getting kids to understand the differences, being mindful as a teacher, and planning for ways to integrate is really crucial. And integrate with, yes, ma'am. I love it. Debbie equals structure. And what about the culturally biased pieces, culturally biased patterns in our lessons, including the assessments? Oh my gosh, we could have another 3-month conversation about how biased the assessment system is and the tests themselves. So how do we plan, to have some multicultural exposure, knowing that there's going to be a biased assessment? Learning academic language is an extremely complex process. And for some kids, academic language, even if their native language is English, is a second language. Sometimes academic language is a third language, meaning they have the home language of Spanish, which is maybe informal, and then they have informal English, and then they have to learn academic English. And understanding that the basics of second language acquisition, even for native speakers of English, will come into play. So I'm hoping that Monday, as we really dive into this, that'll be a little more revealing. Always think about, when we start to deconstruct lesson planning and thinking about the language of your content, the vocabulary pieces that you mentioned, and being really familiar with the language that you're going to be teaching, understanding that there are 4 domains of language, so that in every lesson we're thinking about listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Honestly, elementary people, you guys have the speaking part down pat. You, for whatever reason, culturally, and I'm not saying all high school or middle school classrooms are quiet, but they tend to be more on the quiet side. And we could always have a conversation about what the administration expects in terms of noise coming out of a classroom or a classroom being quiet. But in elementary school, there's typically a lot of verbalization going on. Kids are allowed to get up and talk to each other. And so we want to carry that over into the high school setting. On Monday, we're going to talk a lot more about how to frame that verbal piece so that it leads to academic language in other ways, in other domains. Because there are connections up in our minds about this with our brains. Receptive pieces of language. Receptive meaning it's coming in. So if I read something, I'm looking at it. It's coming in to my eyes. If I'm listening to something, it's coming in through my ears. So the two domains of language that would be on the receptive side are reading and listening. On the productive side, there are two. What would they be? Speaking and writing. And we know that there are cognitive connections on the receptive side and on the productive side. So when we speak in an academic way, that's practicing producing academic language, which then helps us when we begin to write. On the receptive side, if I am having an academic conversation and I'm in kindergarten or pre-K, you should hear, I'll give you some examples on Monday, of the way these kids talk. They talk like scholars. Contrary to popular belief, first grade, the antecedent is first grade. When I'm having an academic conversation and with a peer, and he or she is listening to me and taking that in, there's then this connection that allows that to kind of be reproduced, whether it's in spoken form or written form. And if they read it and they've already heard it, or vice versa, it helps make connections. Anybody listen to books on CD? Can't even say books on tape anymore. Dang it. Right. Yeah, any downloaded books. So I'm a big Harry Potter fan, and I read the books first, and then I listened to them. And it helped me pronounce a lot of words that I would maybe not have pronounced the same way just by reading them. So just little kind of nuances, and truly understanding how important it is for kids to start thinking about the language process. We can think about it in our lesson planning, but we have to make plans for the students to think about it as well. Understanding that some kids have what we call a silent period. And I also know that some kids never have a silent period and you wish they would. Anybody have a student that didn't really want to talk? And then all of a sudden, yeah, like full sentences. It's okay. It's supposed to happen. And making sure that we're planning for peer interaction is really crucial with that structure. Understanding that it can't just be, okay, like we do here in trainings, you guys get together and do this. You guys get together and do this. It has to be really structured. So you five are going to work together, and this is your role, and this is your role, and this is what you're going to do, and this is what you're going to do. We're going to start at this time. I'm going to check on you in 3 minutes. The final product is this, and it's all written so they can see it rather than just listening. Because how many times have you gone into small groups and the first thing you hear the kids say is, "What are we doing?" Yeah. So having some kind of guide sheet. The purpose of this activity is, and maybe your role is the facilitator, and you got to make sure that the rest of your group understands what it is that we're doing. Structure. Yeah. And everybody needs to feel like they have a purpose, even if that doesn't involve talking or writing. That's a great question. What are some things that need to happen in a group that don't require speaking? In what way? Okay, or illustrating. So if part of the product involves a drawing, maybe the person doesn't want to necessarily talk, but they're okay to draw a picture. What else? What are some other nonverbal pieces? Uh-huh. Note taker or scribe. Timekeeper, the artist. What if the note taker can't take notes in English?